welcome. So let me. So first, I welcome. First, I'm very happy that we have Dr. Hashmi as our guest and speaker. Also, I welcome all of you, dear friends, including Dr. Masalai, which really did all the coordination and the work for these lectures, and all dear friends are coming. Maybe they were fasting or they're near the suhoor. So please keep us in your prayers. So I will share the PowerPoint to start kind of maybe some introduction, brief introduction, and then we will have the speech by our guest, Dr. Hashmi. So do you see my screen, Dr. Masaleh?
Yes, we have it.
Thank you. So as we said, this is the 3 Ramadan nights with Harvard scholars. So this is the second night. The second night, our esteemed speaker is Dr. Jawati Hashmi, which is he's a PhD candidate in Islamic Studies at Harvard University and research director of Muslim Impact, Muslim Public Affairs Council. The topic or title of his talk is Muhammad and the Submitters. A kind of the belief is crossed. That means kind of is the explaining and clarifying the meaning of these two, or which one includes the other one. And then the subtitle is When Jews and Christians Were Muslims. The abstract is detailed. I think you can see it in the Telegram channel, because I want to save time. I'm not going to read it, but I recommend people to read it. And it's we are thanking him for this detailed abstract with all the talk in perspective. But I want to go to a brief biography of Dr. Jawad Hashmi. Dr. Hashmi is a board-certified emergency physician, former fellow of medical ethics at Harvard Medical School, and a PhD candidate in study of religion, Islamic studies at Harvard University. In addition to his medical training, Dr. Hashmi holds a bachelor's and master's degree in Arabic and Islamic studies from UC Berkeley and Harvard, respectively. He was formerly a Kathleen Davis Fellow of Peace and Al-Walid Fellow at Harvard University. Dr. Hashmi specialized in Islamic studies with a focus on Qur'anic studies, Islamic intellectual history, and the question of religious violence. His dissertation work explores the ethics of war and peace in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition. Dr. Hashmi wants to keep his research relevant to contemporary discourses on Islam, modernity, and ethics. In this regard, he believes the need to foster religious literacy, interfaith understanding, and human rights discourse. I mean, besides that, Dr. Hashmi is besides his research activities and academic activities, and maybe medical, he's also the director of research at the Director of Research and Strategic Communication and Muslim Public Affairs Council. I'm not sure you guys are familiar, but with Muslim Public Affairs Council, but it's founded in 1988 as a national, in the United States, national public affairs nonprofit organization, working to promote and strengthen American pluralism by increasing understanding and improving policies that impact American Muslims. As a part of their mission, which is related, I think, more directly to the position of Dr. Hashmi in this impact mission is to improve public understanding and policies that impact American Muslims by engaging our government, media, and communities. In this regard, Dr. Hashmi is very active in social media in a very positive way, effective way. You can find his channel in YouTube, which is related to this task. And also, I personally follow him on Twitter. You know, he has about 8,000 or more followers. And so his channel is very informative. Regarding his academic publications, you can also look at his academia page, and his publications are over there. So without further ado, I give the podium to Dr. Hashmi and listening to this. So let me stop sharing and welcome Dr. Hashmi. We're very glad to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Ramadan Mubarak. Thank you for joining us, even though it's near the end of your fast or right after the fast for some of us. I wanted to specifically thank Dr. Godossi as well as Ustad Hussein for inviting me here. I'm really thrilled at what you're doing here. It's quite unique, at least from two perspectives. One perspective I can see is that you have this kind of Sunnis and Shias talking to each other, which is extremely important. For me, that's especially important because back in my mid-20s, I would say, I was quite a fundamentalist and dogmatist and honestly an anti-Shia bigot. So to be invited here today is quite an honor. And then the second reason why I think this is very important is because this is kind of interfacing between the academic setting and the educated public. And so this kind of public scholarship is something that I'm very passionate about. So I really appreciate this endeavor. I apologize in advance. My voice is a little bit hoarse. So I'll try to get through this without too much of a snag. I'm going to share my screen right now and get started. Please let me know if you're seeing the right thing. So you should be seeing my PowerPoint. Let me just close these. Just give me 1 second here. All right, so the title of my presentation is Muhammad and the Submitters. You may have thought initially that this is a typo, that I have believers crossed out, but there's a reason why I have it crossed out. And then the subtitle is When Jews and Christians Were Muslims. This title is based on these two books. The first is by Fred Donner called Muhammad and the Believers at the Origins of Islam. This was one of, or perhaps the first book or academic book that I read on Islamic studies that made me think that I need to enter into Islamic studies myself. It had a profound impact on me. I think he got a lot of things right in this book, although I am kind of tweaking his theory a little bit, and that's what this work that I'm working on right now is all about. So I'm actually working on a publication. I'm working on a bunch of publications. My goal is to actually finally submit this by the summer, but fingers crossed. I do have a young child, so that sometimes can put you behind the 8 ball. And then it's not going forward for some reason. Let's see here. Okay. And then the subtitle is based on this book, When Christians Were Jews, the First Generation. So I kind of combined these two books in my title, and you'll see why I did that shortly. But that was kind of the inspiration. It's based on this idea that scholarship has realized, definitely within biblical studies and Christianity and Judaism, but now we're starting to realize with Islam as well, that initially, quote unquote, religions have what we can call fuzzy borders. So after Jesus, or after what we can call the Jesus movement, you had this fuzzy border between Jews and Christians. You might even call it the early movement, like Jewish Christians. It took some time for Judaism and Christianity to completely part ways. So it takes time for social religious movements to develop into fully discrete or reified institutionalized religions. Reified is just a word that we academics like to use for referring to a fully concretized religion that's distinct from other religions. So that's the term reification. So basically, I'm arguing that initially fuzzy borders existed in pretty much all of the major religions, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, etc. And the names of religions actually usually come much later, after their quote unquote founders. Now, the question is Islam an exception? That's really what the debate is going to be about. And that's the question that one scholar, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, asks. And we're going to look at his work on this. So he wrote this book, The Meaning and End of Religion, which is also a very influential book in my thinking. But he gives the example of Guru Nanak, who's the founder of, quote unquote, founder of Sikhism. So this is a good example because it's in the modern period in the 16th century. But what he writes is that Guru Nanak was actually a devotee of Hinduism, but also participated in Sufi practices as well. So he kind of wasn't clearly defined as either Hindu or Muslim, but kind of operated in a space in between. In fact, he attacked religious formalism of all kinds. And it was only several generations later, according to Cantwell Smith, that his followers were religiously formalized and systematized and became what we can today call Sikhs or Sikhs. In fact, in the work that I'm writing, I quote a Sikh scholar or professor who's claiming that Guru Nanak was a Sikh already at that time, but Cantwell Smith would push back against that idea and say that, in fact, it's only later followers who would say that he's a Sikh as opposed to a Hindu or Muslim. I say Sikh, although probably the proper pronunciation is Sikh. So he has a famous quote, "There is no Hindu and no Muslim." What's interesting is that many later Sikhs will take this and say, aha, see, he was Sikh, not Hindu or Muslim. But I think that's actually going against what he was actually trying to say, which is he's trying to break down these religious boundaries and formalism. And I think many Muslims, modern Muslims, have done the same thing when it comes to certain quotations from the Quran. Of course, this is not just modern Muslims, but in our tradition as well. But that's what we're going to get into. One other point is I kind of channeling Max Weber here, who was one of the founders of modern religious studies. He argues that the quote-unquote founders of religions are really what we can call charismatic figures. They break tradition and the status quo, and they are trying to reform social or religious norms. But after those quote-unquote founders die, there's this kind of routinization process that takes place, or the routinizing of charisma. So this takes place in Sunni Islam pretty much right after the death of the Prophet and the early caliphs. You have this kind of routinization process done by the ulama. It might have taken place afterward in the case of Shiism, because you had imams such as Ali, who carried on this kind of charismatic presence. But the point is that at some point you go from the social religious reform movement, and then you develop into a new and distinct religion, which seeks to uphold the status quo and protect tradition. So part of this reification process is the hardening of confessional lines, defining who is in and who is out. The way I kind of think of this is to give a contemporary example of like a startup. I consider the religious quote unquote founders to be like startup founders who are trying to break the status quo and do something dynamic and different than kind of the status quo companies that exist. But eventually those founders, those companies, those startup companies themselves become like those companies. So Google in its start was this kind of dynamic, against the grain kind of startup, but eventually it becomes just like IBM, just like Microsoft, just like the organizations that it's trying to combat. And so that's just a normal process. So coming back to Wilfred Cantwell Smith's book, the question might be, well, is Islam an exception? After all, the word Islam does occur in the Quran itself. So Cantwell Smith asks this question, but then concludes that if we look carefully at the Quran, we find, first of all, that the term Islam is used in a different way. And that's something that we're going to explore today. Another scholar who picked up on this a little bit later was Professor Fred Donner, and that's in the book that I told you about earlier, Muhammad and the Believers. What Donner realized, just like Cantwell Smith, is that the word Muslim is only used about 75 times in the Quran, whereas the word mu'min, which translates to believer, is used almost 1,000 times. So what he concludes from this is that Muslim in Quranic usage essentially means a committed monotheist, and Islam means committed monotheism in the sense of submitting oneself to God's will. But the takeaway point is that, according to Donner, and I agree with him, and many scholars are agreeing with this idea now, the early following of the Prophet in his lifetime, they were probably known as mu'minūn, believers, as opposed to muslimūn. Not only this, but Donner argues in this book that early Islam was quote-unquote ecumenical. It was multi-faith. His movement consisted of not just what we today consider quote-unquote Muslims, but also some Jews and some Christians, and perhaps other monotheists as well. Now, initially when Donner's thesis came out, there was mixed reaction to it. There were some scholars who disagreed with it. Patricia Crona is a famous example of somebody who really wrote against it, arguing that this is just kind of a liberal myth, a feel-good liberal myth to make liberals and liberal Muslims feel good that early Islam was ecumenical. But as Michael Penn now writes in his book, Envisioning Islam, what was once relegated to a handful of specialists has become increasingly mainstream in the study of classical Islam. And there are several recent works which have kind of reinforced this idea, reinforced Donner's thesis. And pretty much now, most or many historians of early Islam are agreeing that it's very difficult to differentiate in the 7th century between Islam as a religion and other monotheistic traditions. So the takeaway is, although not without its detractors, such scholarship suggests a fairly substantial paradigm shift. So here is a non-exhaustive list of scholars who agree with some version of what can be called the pan-Abrahamic thesis and or fuzzy borders. So what's interesting is that even Patricia Crona herself would fall in this list, as would others who have written against Donner's thesis, such as Robert Hoyland. So these scholars notice, like Donner, notice that in the Quran itself, there seems to be a difference between Muslim and mu'min. For example, in verse 48:16, the Quran reads, "The Bedouins say, 'We believe.' Say, 'You believe not.' Rather, say, 'We have submitted,' for belief has not yet entered into your hearts." I would stress this political aspect of submission. So in this verse 48:16, you see that submission can also mean like political submission. Say to the Bedouin who stayed behind, you will be called against a people possessed of great might. You will fight them until they will submit. So this is where my intervention comes into play. I think that Donner got a lot of things correct, but I think he accidentally mixed up believer and submitter, or mu'min and Muslim. In fact, I think mu'min is the narrower term, but it refers to a believer in God and the Prophet Muhammad, and specifically a follower in the Qur'anic dispensation or Qur'anic law. Meanwhile, I believe Muslim is the wider term and refers to anyone who is a submitter to God, that is a submitting monotheist. As such, it could potentially include some Jews, some Christians, and other monotheists who submitted to God. Now, here's the key point. They still had to submit to the Prophet Muhammad, but I believe that that is in a lesser sense than we think of it today. That could just be in a social and political sense, but we'll get into the details of this shortly. And they also had to submit to the godly community, that is the submitters community that was led by the Prophet Muhammad. But the key point here is that they could still follow their own scriptures and religious laws. So that's how this theory of mine differs from kind of the traditional or traditionalist paradigm. So to sum up, I believe that there was this community of submitting monotheists. The believers, again, were those who believed in Muhammad as their prophet and who followed Quranic law. Jews and Christians could be considered muslimūn, or submitting monotheists, if they submitted to God religiously and to Muhammad from a social and political perspective, perhaps or likely even accepting him as a prophet sent to the Arabian Gentiles, but not a prophet that they had to follow as far as the laws that he brought down specifically. But if they at least submitted in this sense, they were united with the believers and the believing community. Again, the key point, submitting monotheists could still follow their own scriptures and religious laws. I repeated this slide only because sometimes I find people need this to be repeated because they don't understand what I'm saying, because it is going against kind of the orthodox or traditional narrative. The key point, again, is that all of the above could secure salvation. So I argue, according to the Quran, it's not just quote unquote capital M Muslims who can attain salvation, but also Jews and Christians. An interesting comparison, which is relevant since this is being hosted by a Shia organization, is that I actually think that there's a good comparison here to Shi'i belief when it comes to the word mu'min and Muslim. Now, I'm sorry for putting this huge text on the screen. I put this in last minute. I just imported it from my essay or my publication on this, but I'm just going to read it here. A close analogy of this schema that I'm proposing can be seen in the case of Orthodox Shi'i belief, which holds Sunnis to be Muslims, but not necessarily mu'minūn, or believers. Meanwhile, Shias would see themselves as Muslims and mu'minūn. Thus, Orthodox Shi'i scholars would still see Sunnis as part of the Ummah, the religious community, but not as part of the inner circle of the faithful. The Sunnis were considered part of the Awam, or the commoners, whereas the Shias were the Khawas, the elite, being faithful adherents to the infallible Imam. These Shias would also have certain irreconcilable differences with Sunnis on various points of theology, but the shared beliefs between the two created enough of a common bond to consider both to be a part of the same Ummah. Although Shi'i scholars would see their own beliefs as correct, they would still hold out the possibility for salvation to Sunnis who did not cross certain red lines of theological belief, and most importantly, if they did not hold any enmity or animosity against the Imam or prophetic household. Sunnis under Shi'i Fatimid rule, for example, could even follow their own books of hadith and Sunni laws, or fiqh. So I argue that we can see that on numerous levels, this analogy works to illustrate what the situation might have been for the Jewish and Christian submitters in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. Although they were not a part of the inner circle of believers, these Jews and Christians could still join the saved community, or the Ummah, and thus also hope for salvation so long as they did not display enmity to the Prophet and submitted to his social political authority. Similar to the case of Sunnis under Shi'i Fatimid rule, Jewish and Christian submitters in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad could continue to follow their own scriptures and laws, which were seen to have enough divine truth in them so as to have salvific potential if properly adhered to. So that is, in a nutshell, my thesis. You may agree or disagree with it. That's my thesis. In academic world, not everyone agrees with all the theories out there, but just take it for what it will. This is what I'm going to try to prove today. This differs from the traditional narrative in significant ways. So in the traditional narrative, academic scholars now of Quranic studies in early Islam argue that the traditional memory of the pre-Islamic Arabian time period tends to downplay the presence of Judaism and Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula. The reason why we think that it's downplayed is if you read the Quran itself, you'll see that it's clearly dealing with a para-biblical subtext to it. In other words, it seems to suggest that the audience of the Quran was already, or a part of the audience at least, was already aware of these stories and these biblical or para-biblical motifs. And if that's the case, then it doesn't really make sense how the tradition kind of portrays almost no Jews and Christians. There were some Jews in Medina, but otherwise it seems to downplay the presence of Judaism and Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula. The tradition also seeks to downplay the prophet's role as a merchant, and also tries to claim that the prophet was illiterate. Now, these are all controversial. You may agree with me, you may not agree with me, but the point is that now academics and historians are pushing back against all three of these points and seeing that there was probably more of a Jewish and Christian presence in the Arabian Peninsula. The Prophet Muhammad himself was a traveling merchant, and it is unlikely, or at least we don't think that the evidence in the Quran is that strong for saying that the Prophet Muhammad was illiterate. Instead, we think that he was unlettered or a Gentile prophet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he was illiterate. The reason why the tradition seeks to uphold all of these things is probably because it's trying to say that it was miraculous. How else could the Prophet Muhammad know these stories and have brought down the Quran? Now, I don't think that that is a necessary belief, theologically speaking. I don't think our religion crumbles if you disagree with any of these points, but nonetheless, this is why there is this kind of argument. Furthermore, the traditional narrative tries to say that the Prophet Muhammad brought, quote unquote, capital I Islam, that is, Islam as a wholly distinct religion, fully fleshed out with clear boundaries between Muslims and non-Muslims. That is to say, according to this narrative, Islam came down fully packaged, and it had a fully packaged religious law. That is, the Sharia that we have today is pretty much what the Prophet Muhammad brought. Yeah, our scholars might have developed it for circumstances that didn't exist at his time, but pretty much it was this kind of comprehensive religious law. And then the final point here is that previous religions and scriptures, that is of the Jews and the Christians, were completely abrogated and superseded. They lost their salvific potential. And therefore, anyone who hears of the Prophet Muhammad in a clear and unambiguous way and still does not accept his message, that is capital I Islam, is in a sense condemned to the hellfire. At least that's the default position. There are some exceptions and nuances here, but this is pretty much what the traditional narrative is. And so you can see, if you compare it to the Hadith literature, how what we think the Quran is saying differs from that. So in the Hadith literature, it's pretty clear that anyone who hears about the Prophet Muhammad and is a Jew or Christian but does not accept the Prophet will go to hell. And this is repeated. And so all the Muslims, capital M Muslims, will be saved according to the Quran, and everyone else will be in a questionable place. Now, of course, they leave open the possibility of God's mercy and forgiveness after that, but kind of the default position is that they will have damnation. Now, it's not only in a theoretical sense that this has consequences, but it also has a real world consequence. So according to the traditional narrative, the prophet is supposed to have uttered the words, and there's different narrations, but they all amount to pretty much the same thing, that, quote, two religions should not join or remain in the peninsula or in the land of the Arabs. And that the Prophet Muhammad is said to have said that he would expel the Jews and the Christians from the Arabian Peninsula until he leaves none but Muslims. And it's said that the second caliph carried out these orders as well. You could not possibly have a sharper distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim than this. And that's what the traditional narrative is arguing for. Also, there's the idea of jihad, or now, dhimmatud is a polemical term. It's probably not a term that we should use as academics. But basically the idea that you are to wage jihad against unbelievers and subject them to dhimmi or second-class status. This is kind of the traditional narrative, so it does have an impact in the real world, so to speak. Finally, you have this kind of orthodox view, and I'm sure we have many Shias in the audience today who would appreciate this point, that according to Sunni orthodoxy, the way it kind of conceptualizes history is that basically you had this orthodox group, which is the main root of Islam, and then you had these kind of heterodox groups or heretical sects branching out from this kind of main trunk. This is the view also of Christianity, Orthodox Christianity as well. But scholars of biblical studies and early Christian history have debunked this now and said, in fact, in the early period, there is no main branch of orthodoxy. Instead, they're all competing all different competing groups in the early period. And what won out in the end was just one amongst many, and this developed with time. So just because you're in the majority now doesn't mean that you have any claim to the truth or claim to historical precedent. At least that's what academics and historians would argue, I would say. Now, so that's the traditional kind of view. Western views, as far as Western views towards Islam, and by Western, that's kind of an imprecise term. West is kind of a modern term, so I'm using this a little bit ahistorically or anachronistically. But let's not quibble about terminology. Basically, from its very inception, ever since Islam came on the scene, there's been kind of a Christian bias, you could say, to see as Islam as kind of epigonal to Judaism and Christianity, that is, as derivative of Judaism and Christianity. In fact, Islam was seen as just a Christian heresy. And then even in the modern period, contemporary scholars are busy uncovering, quote unquote, the sources of the Quran, which invariably come from Judaism and Christianity. Now, I myself don't see anything wrong with the third point here, but I think what's good is that in recent years, most Quranic studies scholars have now started to appreciate that the Quran is not just being derivative and borrowing things from other religions. It's not just a one-way borrowing, but instead, the Quran is in conversation with these other sources and traditions, and re-articulating these stories in its own creative way for its own theological purposes and ends. And so I think now it's a good thing that scholars are appreciating the unique genius of the Quran in doing so. And I think I think a lot of Muslims feel uneasy about the idea of sources of the Quran, but I actually think it speaks to the beauty of the Quran and how it's able to interact with these sources in such a beautiful and magnificent way. Now, in the 1970s, and when it came to Western scholarship, you had kind of what can be called extreme revisionism. You may have heard of Hagerism from Krona and Cook. Basically, what they did was they prioritized early non-Muslim sources over the traditional Islamic sources. They didn't do this just because of a bias. They may be biased, but not just because of bias. The reality is that many of the non-Muslim sources are actually earlier than the traditional Islamic sources, such as the Sirah and the Hadith literature. And that's why they said we shouldn't prioritize these later sources, which may just be salvational history, but instead we should prioritize what was contemporaneous to that time period. That's just what historians do. They try to get the earliest sources that they possibly can. But when they did this, they came to some radical results. And they did this all based on the assumption of they questioned or they disagreed with the early Quran thesis. In fact, they put forward the late Quran thesis. And so this was kind of hot in the 1970s. Thankfully, I would say the early Quran thesis was vindicated, and the late Quran thesis has been pretty much debunked. Now, there are a couple scholars who are trying to resurrect it, but they are in a minority. And Fred Donner, who is a historian from the University of Chicago, he raised several arguments in favor of an early Quran even before you had the manuscript evidence, which kind of sealed the deal. He pointed to the lack of historical anachronisms in the text. Historical anachronism is basically just something in the text which points to, hey, this probably comes from a very later period. For example, there was a quote-unquote hadith that was going around on email chain that was during the Gulf War talking about Saddam Hussein. Now, obviously, that's not a hadith that even traditional scholars would take as accepted, but that's a historical anachronism. And based on a historical anachronism, we could actually date that text and say it was probably around the Gulf War that it was fabricated. So that's one of the tools that scholars use to date texts. Well, what they notice about the Quran is that it's devoid of historical anachronisms. There's nothing in it mentioning even the succession debate between Abu Bakr and Ali in it. Well, if the text was still open in this early period, you would expect both sides to have wanted to insert something into it to defend their own side. But instead, you have both of them using pretty much the same text. There's also the archaic language of the Quran from a linguistic sense. And then most recently, we have tons of manuscript evidence, which has been radiocarbon dated and shown that the Quran does go very early. And so this and there are other evidences as well has pretty much sealed the deal for the early Quran, which means that now we can use the Quran to discern what the views were in that earliest period. So that led Donner to some very different conclusions than Krona and Cook and Wandsboro. And so these were the sources that he relied on. He relied on the Quran as, he argued, the most important source for determining the views of the Prophet Muhammad. Put simply, in the Quran, we have a text that just tells us what the Prophet Muhammad preached. And that's amazing for a historian. So when somebody says, oh, we don't have much to go on when we want to figure out what the historical Muhammad was all about, you can push back against that and say, actually, we have a whole book of his views in it. Now, whether or not you take that as a believer and say that it was from God or from the Prophet Muhammad, if you were, just trying to say an atheist, the point is, the Quran came from his mind and his mouth, whether you think it's divinely inspired or not. And so I think this is hugely important if you're a historian. The other source that Donner uses is the quote unquote Constitution of Medina, or what he calls the Ummah document. Now, we don't have this as a physical copy. It comes as in other sources, but there are multiple reasons why even the most skeptical scholars consider this to be historical. This was a document that was drafted, or a set of documents that were drafted when the Prophet Muhammad arrived in Medina. And we'll talk about this more later. He also relied on some physical evidence, such as inscriptions, archaeological, architectural evidence. And then he did rely on the contemporaneous non-Muslim sources that were often, but not always, in Syriac. There are other sources, other languages as well. And this is why now, if you want to go into Quranic studies, you have to study all these other languages. And that's kind of unique insights that we have that our traditional scholars may not have had. They didn't know Syriac or Hebrew, etc. Now, what we're going to take a look at the sources that we're not going to rely on. But before that, I wanted to talk about the historical critical method, or HCM. Basically, this is the approach that I'm using and what historians use, which is different than kind of the traditional Islamic approach. What the historical critical, and it's borrowed from biblical studies or Christianity, but basically you suspend your inherited presuppositions about what the text means. You don't just use what the tradition says, what the church says, or what the ulama say, and instead you engage in a close reading of the text itself, as well as other relevant sources. And if you're interested in this, this is a really good book by Nikolai Sinai on the Quran from a historical critical perspective. Note, you don't read it through the lens of the later Islamic tradition. That's what I want to reiterate. Now, many Muslims are hesitant to use the historical critical approach when it comes to the Quran and Hadith and other Islamic sources. But notice that we have no problem with using it when it comes to the Bible or the historical Jesus. And this is just a quote that I have from a scholar who's summing up what the consensus is amongst biblical scholars using the historical critical method when it comes to Jesus. And it's interestingly enough, it sounds very similar to what we believe about Jesus from a theological perspective. And so we Muslims like that. But suddenly when it comes to the Islamic sources, we're a lot more hesitant. I think this is a little bit of a double standard. Now, when it comes to the origins of Islam, Muslims are hesitant of this kind of scholarship, but that is nothing specific to Muslims. In fact, all religious communities are, cautious of this kind of scholarship when it comes to the early period. As Stephen Shoemaker, another historian, writes, the history of religions teaches us that, as a general rule, a religious community's memory of its period of origins is usually highly suspect from a historical point of view. Communities tend to remember these events from their past as having occurred in the way that they should have happened, rather than meticulously seeking what actually happened. Fred Donner himself writes about this, about how the later tradition would want to have kind of disguised the traces of what can be called fuzzy boundaries in its early period. Even Robert Hoyland, who was critical of Donner's book, also agrees that the early period was probably pluralist, religiously pluralist in the beginning, and even remained so after some time after the Prophet's death. And later Muslim historians would have wanted to play down this pluralist dimension. This is just another quote by Shoemaker. I'll just skip ahead. But what I wanted to point out was that this does not necessarily need to be understood as a irreligious take. In fact, from my perspective, this is a deeply religious or pious endeavor, because I, as a Muslim believer and academic, want to know what the Prophet Muhammad actually preached and actually said or did. And so I want to use the best tools to do that. And I think the historical critical approach is the best approach to do that. So the sources that are historically reliable in this sense for our study today, we've already discussed: the Quran, the Ummah document, physical evidence, and early contemporaneous non-Muslim sources. The sources that I consider unreliable are the Hadith, the Sirah, the Tafsir, the Asbab al-Nuzul, or the occasions of revelation, and the views attributed to the Salaf. Now, I want to make it very clear Just because from a historical critical perspective, we think that these are unreliable, it does not mean that you cannot use these sources from a religious perspective. I give religious sermons, and in those sermons, I quote many hadiths. And I think many hadiths have great religious value. So I'm not saying that we need to be Quranist or Quran only and reject all of these sources. I'm simply saying that when we conduct historical surveys, I don't think that these are sources that we can rely on in our scholarship. And there's pretty much a unanimous consensus amongst historical or historians about this. I have many quotes about this, but I'm just going to quote one for each of them. For example, when it comes to hadith, F.E. Peters writes, there's almost universal Western skepticism when it comes to the reliability of hadith or these reports. Similarly, with the Sirah, if you want to read a book on the Sirah, I suggest Sean Anthony, who actually takes a moderate and middle road approach when it comes to the Sirah, and I agree with him, but he himself says that scholars must always approach this material with skeptical caution rather than optimistic trust. This is because they were written down much after the events that they describe. And pretty much we can only take a basic skeleton of the course of historical events in the Prophet's life. As Sean Anthony says, we can get a low definition version of the Prophet's biography, but not the high definition or HD version that we kind of grew up with, which can even tell you like, how did the Prophet Muhammad walk or sit on the toilet? How did he drink water? All of these details. I mean, that's an extremely high definition 4K version or whatever the latest is. I don't know, virtual reality, if you want to say. But according to historians, the best we can do is a low, a basic skeleton. That's what we can get, a low resolution image. As far as tafsir is concerned, the classical commentaries, these can be considered part of reception history and valued from that perspective. But I don't think they give us any privileged access to the early period in the sense that there does seem to be a gap between when the Quran was revealed or pronounced and when the Quran was exegeted, so to speak, by the classical exegetes. And this is a quote from Gabriel Reynolds, who argues this as well. So that's kind of the end of the first part of this. And I realize I need to speed up. So I will do so now. So I'll go to the second part of my slide series. So basically, I'm now getting into the meat and potatoes of my presentation. Basically, we all know that the word Islam is in the Quran, and it could sound extremely exclusivist. For example, in verse 319, truly the religion in the sight of God is al-Islam. Whosoever seeks religion other than al-Islam, it shall not be accepted of him. This day I have perfected for you your religion and approved for you as religion al-Islam. Well, this seems like an open and shut case that it's only capital I Islam that can get you to salvation. However, this is not the case, I will argue, because of verses like this one, the most famous one, 262. And it's not only me who's saying this. There, for example, Nikolai Sinai is releasing a book where he uses this verse to say that because of this verse and 569, which is its twin, we can't really take those previous verses as being referring to an exclusivist capital I Islam. But basically, this verse says, truly those who believe and those who are Jews and the Christians and the Sabians, whosoever believes in God in the last day and works righteousness shall have their reward with their Lord. No fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. This is talking about salvation and leaving the door open for Jews, Christians, Sabians, whosoever believes in God in the last day, that is monotheists, open. The door is open for them. So what I argue in my work is that Islam actually has three different meanings. The first is its literal translation, which gives the existential meaning. Muslim as submitter, that is submitter to the will of God, or he's one who submits their will to God, or to the will of God. Islam as submission to God, or as Nikolai Sinai says, the stance of wholehearted, unconditional, and exclusive self-abandonment in, and then absolute devotion to God. And I don't know if Professor Goderzi already spoke to you, but he really focuses on this absolute devotion in religious worship to God. And this is part of the second meaning, which I call the universal meaning of Islam, that is absolute devotion of one's worship to God. Or as Fred Donner says, committed monotheism, or that primordial timeless religion with God. So that's the second meaning. The third meaning is the particularized meaning. Islam as an institutionalized religion, having a time initiated beginning with the Prophet Muhammad and requiring the affirmation of Muhammad as one's religious prophet. I argue that this third definition, or this third meaning, is not in the Quran, and only the first two are in the Quran. So whenever the Quran talks about salvation, it uses these words, no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. And we see that from the very next verse. It's talking about the Garden of Paradise. We see this here, that this verse, you could think is talking about just Muslims, because it says that whoever submits will have no fear on them, nor shall they grieve, and that's what's referred to about salvation. But then you have this verse that we already went over, which shows that no, actually it does extend to Jews, Christians, and others. In fact, I would argue that these are words that were given to all of humankind according to the Quran. When humankind was kicked out of the Garden of Paradise, those words were given, and this instruction was given to humans in general. There are different ways that the tradition has sought to kind of explain away verse 262, abrogation, or saying that it just got canceled out, that it refers to Jews and Christians who converted to Islam, refers to past Jews and Christians, not current Jews and Christians. This was a very interesting one that I saw, but we won't have time to get into that. Or this is the common one that I've heard, that Jews and Christians will be rewarded in this life, but not the next. However, I argue that all of these explanations are not very convincing. In fact, what this shows, all these conflicting and contradictory and even fanciful explanations, are that these exegetes are coming with their preconceived, predetermined theological views and trying to superimpose them onto the Quran. We can't say that this verse was abrogated, I think, because the last surah of the Quran, according to both traditional and Western scholars, is thought to be probably Surah 5, which repeats this verse, basically. And even in this surah, you have that God has perfected you, your religion. And in this surah, you even have how it talks about that there is a moderate community among them, not past tense. So it's clearly talking about current Jews and Christians. You have this similar verse in the Quran, which is talking about Jews, Sabians, Christians, Magians, or Zoroastrians, the idolaters, believers. All of these, it doesn't seem to be talking about past Jews and Christians. It's talking about current Jews and Christians. So the bottom line is that I think the Quran is linking salvation to faith and virtue. It's not focusing on creedal or dogmatic beliefs as such. The Quran is actually very slim when it comes to that perspective and gives a very simple kind of dogma from that perspective. Meanwhile, even though this verse talks about Jews, Christians, and Sabians, what's interesting is this verse doesn't talk about Judaism, Christianity. It doesn't name those names because according to the Quran, I think there's only one true religion. There's only one true deen, which has manifested itself throughout time. It would manifest itself in the time of Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and then finally with the Prophet Muhammad. And then it's always counterposed to idolatry or idol worship. Even the Prophet Muhammad is told to say that he's not an innovation amongst the messengers. This one true religion has different names in the Quran. It's sometimes called the religion, God's religion, the pure religion, the upright religion, the religion of truth, the religion of submission, or Din al-Islam, or primordial monotheism, or al-Hanafiya. But clearly you see here in the Quran that the word Muslim is not used in this kind of reified sense. Here we have Joseph saying that to God, to take him as a submitter unto God, which is clearly in this existential sense. And this is just a quote from a scholar who's arguing that. I mean, if you look at 6.125, it's clear that it's talking about this existential state of Islam, not the reified religion of Islam. And here we see muslimūn being used as an antonym to mujrimīn, which is clearly using it in a different sense than that reified sense. Here, when Abraham and Ishmael, they're praying to God to make them submitters, to make their have a community, a submitting community. Clearly, this is not talking about capital I Islam. In fact, even in a couple verses away from those verses that are at 385, which is used in that exclusivist sense, you see how Islam is used in that existential sense, where the whole universe actually submits the will to God, their will to God. So the question is, are only Muslims, capital M Muslims, following the upright religion or the true religion of God? I would argue no. Instead, al-Islam is referring to the primordial form of religion, and that each of the religions are historical manifestations of God's religion. And that's what Fred Donner argues as well, that the Quran implies that the Torah was viewed by the believers as one edition or avatar of God's law. And of course, the Quran would be another one. So this is how I would understand these verses that we talked about earlier, that it's talking about submission or absolute devotion to God. So I don't see these as exclusivist verses. Instead, I see them being counterposed to idolatry, but encompassing all of monotheism or the correct monotheistic traditions in them. So al-Islam includes those, basically. And the way we really know that is there's even a Quranic variant recorded in the Codex of Ibn Masud, in which it says that, in which it's actually glossed al-Islam to be al-Hanafiya as-Samha, or the primordial, generously tolerant religion, which actually renders the verse in the completely opposite direction. Now, whether you take this variant to be historical or not, the point is that early on, there was this sense that it could be understood in this way. Now, Professor Gudarzi, who's my advisor at Harvard and who you will hear speak or already did hear speak, stresses that the word deen actually has, can often have a religious worship aspect to it, and I am convinced by what he's saying. So in this sense, al-Islam is sometimes referring to the absolute devotion and worship to God, and as such would include people of the book. And I think a close survey of the early part of Surah 5 would bear that out. But I also think that it refers to not only the existential sense, not only to religious worship, but it does refer to, as Professor Juan Kuhl writes, to a primordial religion with God. And verse 30 shows this. That is talking about primordial monotheism. And it's, again, counterposing that to idolatry. And then it's criticizing people who, the Quran is criticizing those people who split into different sects. And I think here it's actually criticizing Jews and Christians for splitting into sects and then rejoicing amongst themselves that only they have the truth. And then, of course, Muslims, we did the same thing. All right, so here you see that the people of the book actually do follow the upright religion, or at least some of them do follow the upright religion. Now, there are some disbelievers amongst the people of the book, but the very next verse, so it's interesting that religious exclusivists will quote verse 98:6, that shows that, look, they are disbelievers, the people of the book, but they don't quote the very next verse, which is 98:7, which shows that actually some of them believe and perform righteous deeds, and they are the best of creation, and this is clearly referring to some from the people of the book. So I agree with Professor Joseph Lombard, who writes in the Study Quran that al-Islam refers to the universal pre-sectarian submission to God, which is the quintessence of all virtuous religions. It's the attitude of submission that is inherent in all true faith. All right. So let me go to my next slide set. Oops. All right. So according to the Quran, I believe the Quran endorses religious diversity. So there's what we can call divinely ordained religious diversity. For example, in verse 548, each community among you, we have appointed a religious law and a religious path. So the Quran does say that there are multiple paths to God, and says, don't worry about your differences, but just focus on racing and good deeds to God, basically, and to do good. And there are multiple verses like this. I won't be able to get into all of them here. So the Quranic stance towards the people of the book, towards the Jews and Christians, is actually, hold on, I'm going to skip that, is that a group of them are led astray, are disbelievers. But it's almost always when it criticizes the people of the book, that is the Jews and the Christians, it almost always emphasizes that it's a group amongst them, not all of them. It's always criticizing a group of them. But then, I think this is the key verse here, Surah 3, 113. But they are not all alike. That is, not all the people of the book are alike. Among the people of the book is an upright community. And so you can look around the surrounding verses, which show that, yes, even though the Quran is highly critical of many Jews and Christians, nonetheless, it actually counts some of them as being amongst the righteous, amongst the muttaqeen as well, the reverent, the salihin. And these are deeply religious terms and terminology. So there are always two groups in the Quran when it comes to the people of the book. We can't pass a monolithic statement. And these are more verses that talk about the two groups amongst the people of the book, some religious and some pious, and some of them disbelieving. And that's also consistent with what Professor Fred Donner concludes, that when the Quran refers to the people of the book, in general, the tone of the passage is usually positive, whereas verses with a negative overtone usually refer to a part of the Ahl al-Kitab, or the people of the book. So what this suggests, he argues, is that the Quran is concerned with the righteous or sinful behavior of some people of the book and leaves open the possibility that people of the book could be amongst the believers, or, as I argue, amongst the submitters. Now, the Quran, one thing that unfortunately is done today is, by Islamophobes and unfortunately by some Muslims, is to read the Quran and argue that, or understand the word kafir as being synonymous with ghair Muslim or non-Muslim. But I don't think that bears out in the Quran. Instead, in the Quran, the kafirs, or the kafirun, refers specifically, I argue, to the the Arabian pagans who rejected the Prophet Muhammad who was specifically sent to them. Those are the kafirs, who are the rejectors, and it doesn't necessarily include the people of the book. Now, if the people of the book ally themselves with these kafirs, then they themselves become kafirs, but it's not an automatic thing, is what I'm saying. In fact, the Quran says for the Muslims, the believers and the Christians and Jews to come to a common word between the two of them. And I argue that the Quran is trying to close the gap between the believers and the Jews and the Christians, and arguing that our God and your God are one, so we should be submitters. Unto him we are submitters. And so I'm saying that the Quran is calling for this from not only a religious perspective, but also from a social political perspective. Now, this is quite radical that I'm arguing that Christians were Muslims. Well, the Quran itself says this. This is a verse that criticizes some of the Christians who were deifying Jesus and saying, would he, that is Jesus, command you to disbelief after your having already been submitters or muslimūn? So we see here the Quran is acknowledging that the Christians were at least submitters or Muslims. All right. Let's skip ahead here. I don't have time for all of this, so I'm going to skip ahead. Now, of course, there's the question of, are the Torah and the gospel corrupted? Because I'm arguing that the Quran allows, and the Prophet Muhammad allowed the Jews and the Christians in the submitting community to follow the Torah and the gospel. What's interesting is, what I'm arguing is that when the Quran criticizes the Jews and the Christians, it actually criticizes them for not following the Torah and the gospel, which wouldn't make any sense if the Torah and the gospel were completely corrupted and abrogated. In fact, the Quran tells them to bring the Torah and to recite it. And here are, I think it's the same verse that I brought up. When the Quran talks about corruption, it doesn't seem like it's talking about textual corruption. It's always talking about they are distorting the meaning of words. And I'm not the only one who has argued this. Now, in the tradition, there were scholars who argued this, but the kind of dominant viewpoint that came out was the idea that the Jews and the Christians textually corrupted the Quran. I think the reason for that is because they were confused by the verse of the Quran that says that the Prophet Muhammad is mentioned in the Torah and the Gospel. And then these Muslim scholars were scouring the Torah and the Gospel and couldn't find the name of Muhammad. And so that's why they came to that conclusion. But I think that's a very literalistic way to understand this verse. I think you could simply just take this verse to be speaking typologically speaking. But in any case, the Quran, in fact, instructs the Jews and the Christians to observe the Torah and the gospel, and even says, say, O people of the book, you stand on nothing till you observe the Torah and the gospel. The previous books are not totally corrupted. They're just hidden. And the Quran is meant, and the Prophet is meant to bring out their clear meaning. So, this is just me repeating the same thing, showing more verses. But the Quran is confirming the previous books that came before it, and protecting them, not abrogating or nullifying them. That's the key point. Now, it is true that Muslim exclusivists will say that the Quran seems to imply that these Jews and Christians need to accept the veracity of the Quran. I would say that that's correct. But what they miss out on is the fact that the Quran also seems to insist that the believers, that is what we today consider Muslims, need to accept the Torah and the gospel. And I would say that we need to accept it as it is, not necessarily that it's a completely wholly corrupted book, as many Muslims believe today. So any of the verses that those exclusivists bring up, interestingly, show that believers also need to, in some sense, respect the Torah and the gospel. So according to the Quran, I argue there's only one book, really, with one kitab with God. This is the divine book, the preserved tablet, and that the different revelations are instantiations or expressions of this kitab with God. And there are multiple verses that talk about this. And Professor Khalil Andani has written his dissertation on this, and I think it's worthwhile to check out his dissertation on this. So according to the Quran, I believe that the Torah, Gospel, and the Quran are seen as parallel scriptures coming from the same source. Now, it is likely that the submitters, that is, whether they were believers, Jews, or Christians, respected all of these scriptures as divine, even if they followed their own respective scripture and laws primarily. The differences between them were seen as inconsequential and mostly in the realm of law. Meanwhile, the submitters likely Quranicized the theology of the Torah and the gospel. So I do believe that the Prophet Muhammad and his early followers probably read the Torah and the gospel through a Quranic lens. Just like many people who engage in kind of interfaith dialogue or debate today, many Muslims who do that, they'll read the Bible in a very Islamic way or a Quranic lens. I think this is probably what they were doing in this early period. All right, so that's this. Almost done, hopefully. Okay, I'll have to speed up, I apologize. All right, now there is the issue of the Quran does criticize Christian belief in the Trinity. This is something that I respond to, but I won't have time to get into it, so I'm just going to skip down. But if you want to know a little about this, I recommend this video that's available on YouTube called Jesus and Mary and the Quran, which would show a much more nuanced picture when it comes to the Quran than many Muslims really follow today. What I'm trying to say is the Quranic critique of the Trinity is actually quite nuanced. And this is another book that I would recommend on that topic. All right, so I'm going to blow past this because we just don't have time. So even though Jesus disassociates himself from the idea of the Trinity and maybe even Trinitarian Christians, at the end of the surah where this is all taking place, Surah 5, he actually asks God to forgive them. So I think that's very, and a very important point that's missed. Muslims today just seem to focus on the verses that are critical of Christians and Jews, but miss the nuances and the subtleties of the Quran. So the Quran actually ends with Jesus, the surah ends with Jesus asking for forgiveness for them, and the Quran responding in a positive way to that response. Now, it's an ambiguous response, but I believe ultimately it's a positive response. And in fact, the Quran has a divine promise to Jesus that Jesus's followers will be placed at a level of respect above the idolaters. The Quran never refers to Jews and Christians as kafirs in toto, nor does it refer to them as mushrikeen. Mushrikeen, or associators, is a term that's only used for the Arab idolaters, and that's something that the later tradition goes in a different direction with. All right. In fact, the Quran considers the Christians nearest in affection to the believers, and says that they're righteous amongst the people of the book. So sorry for going skimming through that, just because we're reaching the end of time. I do want to go through this one real quickly. These are like multiple verses in the Quran that talk about against religious chauvinism or confessional bigotry. I first respond to a point by Nikolai Sinai, who's pointing out that just because the Quran says that this or that group may have salvation, that doesn't mean that they were part of the early community of believers. He's responding to Fred Donner. But I actually argue that that doesn't make sense, because it's simply not convincing to think that there's no connection whatsoever between salvation and membership in the community or the supra community of believers. It was, after all, the saved community at the end of time, surrounded by and set against the rejecting pagans. The Quran is very kind of apocalyptic in that sense, and many Muslims miss out on that point. Indeed, all of the punishment stories in the Quran point us to the belief in the idea of God's punishment was impending, with only the saved community being, as the name implies, saved. So soteriology, that is salvation, is linked to this world, since the Quran speaks of divine punishment not just when individuals are resurrected, but rather against disbelieving communities in this world. Indeed, in some sense, we can think of the Quran's many statements in praise of some of the people of the book and mention of their salvation as enticement for the Jews and Christians to join the saved community against its foes, and to thereby avoid the impending divine punishment. At least this is my argument. All right, I'm going to go past this, but these are the verses that are talking against religious chauvinism. So the Quran criticizes the Jews and the Christians who say, none will enter the garden unless he be a Jew or a Christian. These are their vain hopes. And what do Muslims do today? We just say, none will enter the garden unless he be a Muslim. But the Quran argues against this. Nay, whosoever submits his face to God will, while being virtuous, shall have his reward with his Lord. No fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. And this is very similar to the verse that we talked about earlier, 262. So the Quran is actually speaking against this kind of saved sect mentality, where the Jews say the Christians stand on nothing, and the Christians say the Jews stand on nothing, though they both recite the book, the Kitab. Well, what do we Muslims do today? We say the Jews and the Christians stand on nothing. But the Quran is really going in this ecumenical or open-minded approach, or wheresoever you turn, there's the face of God. The Quran is against this idea of just being a Jew or a Christian. There's so many verses that I can't go through all of them. This is a very pluralistic verse, the Die of God, verse 2:138, but I can't go through it. This is very powerful. The Quran says, this is talking to the Jews and the Christians who are saying that heaven is only for them. It says, say, if the abode of the hereafter with God is yours alone to the exclusion of other people, then long for death if you are truthful. And I would argue that many Muslim exclusivists should think about this verse as well. All right. More ecumenical verses. They're just too many to talk about, so I have to go past this. The Quran criticizes Jews and Christians for saying that they are the children of God or the saved sect. What do Muslims do today? We say we are the saved sect. According to the Quran, salvation is not based on which sect or group you belong to, but rather based on faith and virtue. That's what I'm arguing here. I know I'm going to give you vertigo by going through all of this very fast, but basically the Quran is saying that all of humankind is equal, and the most noble of you before God are the most piously righteous of you. And this piety or righteousness is not specific to capital M Muslims. And this is, of course, the opposite view is found in the Hadith, which I believe these Hadiths come from a later period. All right, and my last set of slides, which I think are perhaps the most interesting, which is the extra Quranic proof. So we have the Constitution of Medina, which talks about that this is a document between the believers and the submitters. This would be confusing if muʻminūn and muslimūn were the same, exact same. Why would it talk about two different groups? So on my theory, this makes more sense. Now, this text, this document did say that arbitration should be done by the Prophet Muhammad. And that's probably what, if you wanted to be in the saved community, that was the bare minimum that you had to accept of the Prophet Muhammad. You had to affirm that in case of dispute, and that's why Prophet Muhammad was brought to Medina. He was brought to be an arbiter. If you accepted his authority as an arbiter, I think then in that case, you could be part of the saved community of submitters. But this text does say that the Jews were a community, an ummah with the believers. So that's very interesting. We use the word ummah today in this religiously exclusivist sense as just Muslims, but in this early text, we have something very different. And you have that kind of open-minded language that at the end of it, the most worthy of those in this document are the sincerely righteous. Again, it's echoing that Quranic verse that's talking about the most noble of you in the sight of God are the piously righteous. We also have tons of physical evidence. The documentary evidence, for example, shows that the Shahada, only the first element is prominent in that early period. And then after it takes about 70 years for the second part of the Shahada, which is more exclusive, that, affirming the Prophet Muhammad. Now, keep in mind that in my theory or my thesis, I still do think that the submitters had to affirm the Prophet Muhammad. So it's not a blow to my theory if this turns out to be not true. But it does show something quite interesting, that the emphasis was on the unity of God as opposed to specifically to the Prophet Muhammad. So there was documentary evidence, numismatic evidence, which is coins and other stuff that Fred Donner looks at, which reinforces this idea that the emphasis was all on the unity of God as opposed to specifically to the Prophet Muhammad. The inscriptional evidence also shows pretty much the same. There's architectural evidence that's very interesting. So in the early period, in the first generation, there were mosques that were built right next to churches. We know that the early believers prayed in churches. They honored churches. Mosques and churches shared spaces. They had courtyards that were adjoining each other. And so this kind of multi-faith thing that, that maybe some religious exclusivists make fun of today, where we build like mosques next to churches. Actually, that's hearkening back to the earliest period. You even had the prayer space, the niche in the church that was built inside of the church, even as the churches were still functioning as churches. And then, of course, you have the non-Muslim literary sources, which show that the early movement seemed to consist of Jews and Christians, but definitely some Jews. These are Syriac texts mostly, but also there are in other languages too. For example, here you have a believing emir, which we would consider a quote-unquote Muslim, demanding of this other person, this Christian, that either you follow what's in your gospel or you follow what's in the Quran. But what that's showing is that the early believers were allowing these other religious groups to follow their own religious law. As long as you had a religious law that was fine, you could follow that. All right. In the early period, not only you have this patriarch saying that not only did these Arabs who invaded us, not only did they not fight Christianity, they even recommended our religion. They honored our priests and saints. We know in the early period that the believers shared, Christians and quote unquote Muslims shared spaces, meals, and courts. There was a lot of intermarriage that went on. Also in the Quran, in Surah 5, you have people of the book, you're allowed to marry them, you're allowed to eat their meat. This simply would not be the case, I argue, as historians of religion would view this as, it's unthinkable that the Quran would then consider them damned to hell, because if you're allowed to eat their meat, intermarry, the whole reason we're not allowed to do that with pagans is because they're damned. So that just doesn't make any sense. All right. So a lot of evidence, but I just can't get into all of it. Now, it's quite surprising to many people when you say, how could you be a Jew and a Christian and believe in Prophet Muhammad? That seems like an oxymoron to us moderns. And this is what Michael Penn, the historian from Stanford, says, quote, "The surprise for modern readers is the willingness of an 8th century Christian to refer to Muhammad as God's messenger." In fact, at this early period, you might have had flexible views about what constitutes prophethood and what constitutes scripture. And this is what Fred Donner is arguing here. So they may just have had a looser conception of prophecy or messengership or apostleship. Stephen Shoemaker, another historian, talks about this. The category of scripture seems to have been rather fluid for the early believers. So even though the Christians and Jews in that community were expected to follow their own scriptures, that authority was seen parallel to rather than supplanted by Muhammad's revelations. All right, and there's more texts here. Now, at some point in time, the Jews and the Christians were, quote unquote, expelled from the Ummah. And then you had to back project that expulsion, that metaphorical expulsion, into the early period of Islam. And in fact, then you even had to say that that was a physical expulsion. But this is a later period. There was an early sect of Judaism called the Isawiya who thought that the Prophet Muhammad was a prophet sent by God, but that his mission was not directed to the Jews themselves, and that the Jews themselves ought to retain their ancestral laws. There were early Christians who believed Jesus was a human prophet. And so I actually argue that it's not insurmountable if you think that the Christian submitters probably were Unitarian or leaned in that direction. And that's why I think the Jews and the Christians who followed the Prophet Muhammad were in a minority. Most Jews and Christians probably did reject the Prophet's message. But that doesn't change the fact that some of them did embrace it. Here you have a Christian patriarch, Timothy I, who is praising the Prophet Muhammad and saying that the Prophet Muhammad was obviously on the road of the prophets. We can even look at the early Islamic heresiographical literature, which shows that there were groups that did believe that the Prophet Muhammad was a prophet, except that he was a prophet for the Arabs and not for others. And so this heresiographical literature is actually condemning those people who believe that. In fact, there's a quotation from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal in which he gets extremely angry when someone says that Jews and Christians were a part of the Ummah in that early period. Ibn Hazm actually says that this is kind of an extreme view in one sense, but it tells you something in another sense, that he actually thought that people of the book only get dhimmi status, protected status, if they recognize Muhammad as a messenger of God to at least the Muslims or to the Arabs, and refrain from injuring his honor. Well, I think this shows you that in the early period, there were Jews and Christians who held such beliefs. And here is a Jewish philosopher of the 12th century who believed this. And then in the modern period, there are many Christians who remain Christian and yet believe that Prophet Muhammad was a prophet in some sense. And here's a non-exhaustive list of such figures. And so that's it for me. I'm now open to questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Hashmi. So, Dr. Wadusi, all yours, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hashmi, for it is very thought-provoking. I'm pretty sure any questions people have. I do read them. I don't know, I haven't seen any raising hand yet. So for now, I read the questions. Someone's interested also can raise their hand. So let me read a couple of them, and then maybe there was some overlap, but I will ask that by the order I received them. So interesting. So, and most are long a little bit. Interesting talk. I understand Islam developed over the period of 23 years. I'm also aware of some sort of agreement between the Prophet and Jews soon after migration to Mecca. However, that agreement was nullified soon after the first battle. I have the following questions. By the death of Prophet, were any Jews or Christians left in Medina, or all of them converted, even it was by force? When, how, and why Muslims expelled Jews and Christians from Islam according to your theory? If Quran considers Jews and Christians as Muslim, why the followers of the Prophet went against Quran?
So do you mind if I answer that first, the first volley first?
Are there any Muslim scholars in the history of Islam whose record resonate with your theory? These are three questions by the same person. I mean, should I say it again, or was it clear?
No, I think that's perfectly fine. I can answer that. Thank you so much.
You're muted, I think. Or no, sorry.
No, I think he's fine. Yeah,
that's fine. I was muted. Yeah.
So, so yes, according to the traditional narrative, it is correct that the traditional narrative portrays it that the Prophet Muhammad moved to Yathrib or Medina, initially had an agreement with the Jews and was inclined toward them, or at least, they were they had friendly relations initially, and then things soured, and then over the course of time, not only was that affinity broken, but in fact, Jewish tribes were expelled. And eventually the Prophet Muhammad on his deathbed is said to have said to expel all the Jews and the Christians from the Arabian Peninsula. So that is the traditional or traditionalist narrative. But that is what historical critical scholars are pushing back against. Not only just me with my theory, but also several other scholars, because what the early sources are showing, and these are non-Arabic sources, it's showing that actually Jews and Christians still persisted in that early movement in the first century. And so that's what I got into at the end of my talk. And so that's why we're reevaluating that traditional narrative. So that's the answer to that. As far as when, how, and why Muslims expel Jews and Christians from Islam according to your theory, I think it was at a very later period of time in which it was more of a metaphorical expulsion, in the sense that battle lines were drawn between Muslim, capital M, and Christian. And in fact, a lot of that started with Christians themselves, because there were Christians leaders who were very disturbed by this kind of interfaith mingling that was going on, that was making them uneasy in that early period. And then eventually that was mirrored by the other side. And I also think what happened was that the reason why Jews and Christians would join that movement was because they believed in the Prophet Muhammad as a social, political, on a, not just a religious perspective, but a social, political perspective, and as a religious arbiter. Well, after his death, that no longer applies. So it would naturally explain why, after a certain point, Jews and Christians wouldn't be a part of that movement. As far as the third question, are there any Muslim scholars in the history of Islam whose record resonates with your theory? Well, I would say that there were Muslim thinkers, Islamic thinkers, who were religiously pluralist, who were not exclusivists in that sense. For example, the Islamic philosophers. But as far as this specific theory, no, I would not say that that is a pre-modern theory. That's more in line with what Fred Donner, for example, has put forward. It's just a variation of his theory. All right. So now I'm going to go on to.
We have Mr. Ghulam Sadat raise his hand. So if you're done with these questions, we can have an oral question and then go back to the written question.
Sure, no problem.
So Mr. Sadat, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Hashmi. Very interesting talk. So my understanding is that Muslims believe that the Quran is the literal word of the God. And if they go against it, or if they don't believe it, they're basically kafir, they are not Muslim anymore. What you are saying is that majority of the Muslims' understanding, and probably for the most of this 1400 years, Muslims actually went against the word of God, and they expelled Jews and Christians from Ummah. So basically, most of the Muslims are kafir.
Well, that's definitely not what I'm saying, but thank you so much that's a good way of putting it, in the sense that that allows me to respond to that. So I would put this a different way. I would put it this way. If someone insists that modern scholars cannot come to a viewpoint that differs from the tradition, that's a pretty extreme view to have, that there can be absolutely no disagreement with the tradition. We wouldn't expect that, for example, in Christianity, like with biblical studies. We don't expect that modern scholars who are biblical studies are beholden to what Thomas Aquinas said, St. Augustine said, what the church has said. We just take it as a matter of fact that traditions change over time and different views evolve. So there's not this one thing that's called orthodoxy that existed from the beginning and has come to the present period in an unaffected way. So that's what I would say from that perspective. So yes, even though it is a different viewpoint, it's not the case that I would say that whoever takes a different viewpoint is a kafir. And I would also push back against the idea that all Muslims believe that the Quran is the uncreated word of God. There's a big debate about that, about what that means. And even historically, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis didn't really believe in that. But this is a discussion for another time, that part. I think Professor Celine Ibrahim has a question. So do you think we could ask her next?
Yes, please, and then I go to the written questions. Yeah. Dr. Ibrahim. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. That was a fantastic talk. And I actually have 3 questions, but I'll limit it to one at a time and see if we have time for the other 2.
How about you just ask all 3 and then I'll pick them?
Okay, and then see which one you like.
Yeah, thank you.
My first question is, do you know of anybody working on historical critical studies of hadith, specifically looking at the ones that would go against some of the claims that you're trying to make, looking at the Qur'anic sources? So that's one. My second one is, being in the realm as I am of interreligious dialogue and the like, I'm running up to an issue where we're having more interreligious dialogues where people from Wiccan and pagan and different orientations, and I'm finding myself awkwardly a Muslim in those spaces, because it's easier to be a Muslim in relation to Jews and Christians and Abrahamic dialogues and the like, but it's slightly more difficult when so I'm just I'm asking what insights you might have from thinking interreligiously about what the Quran has to say about kafirs and Arabian paganism, and how I'm curious how you think that relates to this reemergence of paganism today. And then the third question, I was curious, because as someone myself who goes back and forth between academic spaces and Muslim devotional spaces, I'm curious if you have time and would like to share about how that's been as part of your training, going back and forth between these spaces, and have you found that you've had to change your ways of approach or your discourse as you move back and forth, and what has that been like in terms of your academic training and your presence in devotional spaces?
Well, thank you so much, Professor Ibrahim. I'm a big fan of your work, so glad that you made it today. And you asked 3 excellent questions. As far as the first one, which you asked about hadith, so the guy that I look up to and on that front is Dr. Joshua Little, who just graduated from Oxford University. So he's doing some cutting edge stuff when it comes to hadith studies, which had kind of stagnated, to be very honest. So he's kind of reviving it, I feel like. And he's the kind of go-to guy. He's on Twitter as well. But what I would say is that at this current juncture, the conclusion of Western historical critical scholars when it comes to hadith is quite grim or skeptical. There might be a historical kernel is the view, but it's very hard to know what that historical kernel is. And there's even despair amongst some that we might not ever be able to figure out what that historical kernel is. From my perspective, from a faith-based perspective, I think it's okay to use hadiths from a religious perspective, even if we're not sure if it goes back to the Prophet Muhammad. So I don't think it's a devastating blow to faith. I know some people think that. I certainly don't. And I, like you, I think, am kind of interested in this Qur'anic turn, which is where we emphasize the Quran, and only secondarily do we then go to other sources like the hadith. At least I'm assuming that that might be your case. The second question was about interfaith dialogue, which, if I understood your question correctly, is about how do we include non-Abrahamic faiths, as well as especially maybe Hinduism, and you didn't mention Hinduism, but I'm just thinking off of the top of my head, and also paganism, which is also kind of re-emerging. Well, what I would say is this. The Quran, according to like one scholar, he has a very good quote where he says that basically the Quran was extending the possibility of salvation to every religious group that existed at that time. Except, I guess the exception would be the pagans at that time, who are the kafirs, but they're kafir because they are rejecting the prophet that was specifically sent to them. So one of the questions I get asked is, why do we need Islam, capital I Islam anyways, if you're saying that the Bible and what came before was not abrogated? Well, I think the reason is because the Quran was specifically addressed to the Arabian pagans first and foremost. It came in the Arabic language. So the people who reject their specific prophet do become rejectors. And it's not just a ideological rejection, of course, it's a physical rejection, persecuting, trying to kill the prophet. So I just don't think that that applies to the people who are using the label pagan today. They're not the Arabian pagans of that time to whom the Prophet Muhammad was sent. So that's how I would take it. And then the third question was a great question, which is, how do I differentiate between, how do I square away the religious aspect from the academic or historical critical perspective? That's something that I struggled with throughout my entire time in graduate school. I did my master's at Harvard Divinity School with the idea that this is a divinity school where they would support this kind of thinking, where you wear one hat, religious hat, and you wear an academic hat. But interestingly enough, it was not like that at all. It was, at least for Muslims and Islamic studies, the divinity school was extremely secular, even to the point where it would be even hostile to this kind of thought. So when I became a teaching fellow, I actually just embraced it. The students loved it because of that. I had like Muslim students who, like, my office hours were full actually, because people were dying to speak about it. And so I just decided I'm not going to fit the mold. I have a medical degree I can fall back on if the academy doesn't like it. So I just say, let's embrace our two aspects. But what I do think that I'm doing a little bit differently is that I think you need to figure out, are you going to compartmentalize? Because that's what a lot of people do. I'm not a fan of compartmentalization. For me, my academic critical research drives my theological thinking. I try to make that the direction as opposed to the other way around, because I think if it's the other way around, then it just becomes purely apologetic. And like I said, I want to know what the real historical Muhammad said and did. And so I want to use the historical toolkit to determine that. And then from there, I can adjust my theological beliefs. Now, of course, from a subconscious sense, the questions I ask, what views I lean towards, of course, that's going to be affected by my religious beliefs. So, and of course, I'm going to be attacked on both sides. I'm going to be attacked by the more secular academics, and I'm going to be attacked by the more traditionalist Muslims. But it's okay. I embrace that. So I hope I answered your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We are receiving few questions. They are long questions, actually good written.
Yeah.
I mean, because I think we can keep them, discuss them. I have something myself too, but I put it later on. So if one question I received order was that I'm curious to know how the term submitters can be applied to Jewish and Christian communities living at the time of Prophet, when there is continuous differentiation of the groups from the immediate followers of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by using explicit terms like Jews, Yahud, and Christian, Nasara, or people of the book, and criticizing some of their core beliefs, such as the crucifixion of Jesus' Trinity, as Jews' lack of recognition of the Prophet Muhammad. And I'm not sure if the submitter thesis is too different from what Faradana revisionist thesis of community of believers, or the Orientalist scholarship approach to the Prophet Muhammad message is simply another historical Judeo-Christian deviation development. Traditional Islamic scholarship is deeply aware of Islam having a double meaning of submission, as well as a capital M Muslim identity as a separate and distinct community, while acknowledging that some Jews and Christians are also able to enter paradise as believers of God, but the Quran holistically differentiate the Prophet and his followers from Jews and Christians. For some reason, Orientalist revisionist scholars seem to do a very selective reading of the Quran that supports their own preconception with appreciate their clarification. I think if I choose my position too, because I put one addition to this question. I think I enjoyed your talk, but I think conflation of two things has happened. One thing is religious pluralism, okay, whether Jews or Christians, or for that matter, Sunni and Shias go to hell or to heaven or salvation, or even Indians and native Indians and Indians from India or Chinese. And then whether there was a Muslim identity as Islam, a separate identity of Jews and Christian. I think you are achieving the salvation by diluting the Islamic identity. And then even in Iran, there was dispute. Dr. Shariati said, the unity of Shia Sunni, yes, but not the unity of Tashayyut Sunnah. We cannot dilate the view. I mean, I think this is the mind. I think this is the question I think you should address, because most people feeling that you are achieving the salvation. We agree. I personally agree. I 100% agree with the verses 262, 569 claim for salvation. There are besides Muslims as Ummah in the heaven, but not by diluting the Islam capital with I and this concept. So I think this is this question too. So I have some other, so I'll let you address this point, because I think this is the crucial point in the whole discussion.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a differing viewpoint. And is that question was written down, correct? Is it? I don't see it here anywhere.
Okay. So I don't know. I'm getting some people directly. Okay, I can
I
send
see.
you.
Okay. Yeah, if you send
this,
it to me, if you send it to me, that would be nice, because
so I
it was
start to
pretty
send.
long.
Okay. Yeah. So let's do this. Anytime I read, I will send it to you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Or I think this was sent it from. Okay, I copied.
So
I can send it to Dr. Hashmi.
Both of us. I can. Yeah, I will send.
I
So
have it now.
what I would say is my modification to Donner's thesis, one thing that it does is it actually fends off some of the critique by other scholars, such as Nikolai Sinai, who pointed out that in the Quran, there does seem to be a distinct ritual and cultic practice for the Prophet's followers, such that you see the emergence of, at least the emergence of a new religion, if not a new religion. But my theory does make it so that the believers are the primary recipients of the message and the primary emphasis of the Quran, so that they do have a unique identity compared to the Jewish and the Christian submitters that were socially and politically aligned with them. So it's not completely the case that this waters down a distinct identity. So I'm not saying that, and not only that, but I'm also saying that the Jewish and Christian submitters had to affirm the Prophet Muhammad in some sense. And that sense could be all the way to the point of affirming him as a religious prophet who allowed them to continue following their own scriptures and laws. I would simply state, as far as collateral damage from that belief, that it's watering down things, maybe, but maybe we do need to water that down. I do think that salvific exclusivity causes real world problems. I think the reason why we takfir each other or others is because of this idea. So I do think that there's this intimate connection between takfir and violence and salvific exclusivity and takfir. So now, of course, you shouldn't have a viewpoint just because it's practically a good thing. I'm convinced by the evidence that I've read in the Quran and outside of it. Of course, admitting the fact that we all have our unconscious biases and subjectivities. So someone could say that, oh, you just have a liberal bias, maybe. But ultimately, I think you have to deal with the evidence that's in the Quran and respond to it. So that's what I would say there.
I don't, because I see just one sentence, because there are many questions, and I will ask them to read it, and then maybe at the end one thing. But I understand this takfir is a problem, but Judge Jacques Maritain says, if we have to avoid relativism in belief and action too. So the tolerance should go to the peer person, but not the idea. So a person, because of an idea, shouldn't be persecuted, but not the idea should be tolerated or said everything is equal. You know what I mean? So still we can be Muslim with a different identity. And I think Islam has many examples, the whole Qibla and many other things. I don't want to go to the whole history, but clearly demarcation of identity, even the form of azan, every level Prophets has to keep the idea, but at the same time, you can be a believer Shia, believer Sunni, but still believe, okay, I see good in the other guy too. But that's my point. But because there are other people who have more specific questions, so let me.
Oh wait,
there is one.
can I just?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Just quick response to that is that the comparison that I was actually drawing was the Shi'i understanding, which says that, which includes Sunnis within the Ummah. Even if it does not consider them believers. So I actually don't think that this is relativism, because I'm not saying that the Quran considers all beliefs equal and valid. The Quran has clear theological beliefs and criticisms of Christians and Jews, but that doesn't mean that you expel someone necessarily from the potential for salvation. So I think the accusation that it's cultural relativistic, it doesn't really bear out, or I don't actually agree with that, but I understand the concern though, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that quotation was very, thank you for many, the talk was absolutely rich, absolutely many things, absolutely thoughtful. And that's what we should discuss. Even believe me, we are in Telegram group, friendly. Some of the people are here. We have lots of discussion about salvation. And sometimes I'm surprised, from the people I teach so it's a question in the mind of many people. And then reactions sometimes are different. You think this guy should think like this, but you see, okay. So because I don't want to take time, there is one question. If Brother Hamid is here, because he's near yesterday was like that too, near the fast breaking, he's maybe not here. Because if he asks his question, is better. If not, I will ask. Hamid, are you here?
Yeah, I realized I had to break my fast late. I didn't realize that it already broke.
Oh, sorry. So I thought you're Harvard, Boston is sooner than us. Yeah,
I'm in Los Angeles right now. Yeah.
He's in California, so perhaps hit the start time and then take the most of it.
Yeah, so you are the true scholar. I mean, that's how you should. You are. I know you. How passionate you answer. How passionate you are into. Honestly, everybody asks you something, no matter they're famous or scholar. Because I follow you Twitter, and I really. This is, I think, you're not. What's it called? Farsi say ivory tower. Yeah, we don't know, not you're dressed in an ivory tower. That's, I think, is the important thing. And I think this is the fact Shahid Mutahari says, something. I mean, those who hasn't thought about themselves are going in the new way, they never fall or never do a mistake. This is a bold theory. And I know, as we said, you're modifying donors. Maybe we accept some, we need to work on it more. So let me read my Hamid Olia question says.
I unmuted him. He can raise his question. Yes, he's here.
Salam alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Salam alaikum, Dr. Hashmi. Ramadan Mubarak to you and all the respected people present in the meeting. I want to thank you so much for the amazing and exciting talk. I really enjoyed it. I have just a couple of questions, which were basically my personal questions, because I've thought about this topic a lot, and I'm the least knowledgeable person in this meeting. So please bear with me if my questions were not that much academic. Again, I appreciate your reasoning and personally agree with the general tone of your talk and general conclusion of your talk. But I still have a couple of questions regarding such theories, which I will appreciate if you could address them. So if the theory that you kindly presented today for us is correct, I had three questions. I believe you have answered like two of them, which is why then the Prophet was basically sent. If the Jews and Christians could stay on their old religion, is the Prophet messages only for disbelievers in mushrikin, which I believe you expressed your personal opinion, which is the latter one. And the second question is, if people realize, this is a personal question, which I have like a, not understanding, but I really don't understand how to approach that. So if a person realizes a religion is right, thinking about the people in the Prophet's era, what is the legitimate reason for them not to convert and want to stay in their old belief? After all, it's very different when someone acknowledges something is true and someone who changes the course and does the actual practice. For example, in Quran, it is said that Siyam is something that is definitely written for like all the mu'minīn. So if like I as a Jew, first of all, believe that Prophet Muhammad is like the Prophet, but still I want to stay on my old practice. How is it like working? I mean, this is a dilemma for me, which I don't understand how it's working actually. And the last question is based on Surah Al-Imran, ayah 64. It seems that the fact that the Jews and Christians don't believe is somehow negative. And so I want to know your take on that, because I'm pretty sure you obviously have looked at those verses, which is basically the keyword is khayran lahum, something like that. So I was wondering what is your take on that. Thank you so much for your time, and again, really appreciate your exciting talk.
Thank you so much. Excellent set of questions. And it's actually great because with number 3, you actually gave me an answer for number 1 as well. So the first question was, why was the Prophet chosen if the Jews and Christians could stay on their old religion? Am I simply saying, so I'm saying that although the religion that the Prophet brought, the Quranic dispensation, was primarily for the Arabian Gentiles, I'm not saying it's only for them. I'm saying it's primarily for them. In fact, the Quran says it's better for, just like you said, khayrun lakum, for the Jews and the Christians to convert. They will get a double reward. That's what the Quran says. I do think that the Quran is encouraging people to become full believers, but it's leaving out the potential for salvation for people who are just submitters. They can stay on their religion, follow their own scriptures as long as they follow them correctly. So that's how I understand it. So to answer the first question, yes, it was primarily sent to the Arabian pagans, and the Quran understands the Jews and the Christians to both be under Bani Israel, the children of Israel. So this is sent to the Ishmaelites, basically everyone else in that sense. Now, so the second question is, if people realize a religion is right, what is the legitimate reason for them not to convert? So first, I would say that I'm not sure how many people actually do believe in something and then not follow through on it. But the Quran itself does specifically condemn those people of the book. And I think you can understand it as those Jews who refused to convert, quote unquote, or refused to accept Prophet Muhammad because of the fact that he came from a different stock, a different ethnic stock. He was not from Bani Israel. And from that perspective, they recognized that he was a true prophet, but rejected him anyways. And the Quran condemns them for that. So I think if that is what you're doing, then the Quran condemns that completely. But what about the people who genuinely are not convinced by the Prophet Muhammad or never even heard of the Prophet Muhammad? So I think that that there's a difference between those two cases, basically. And then as far as verse 364, well, I would say it's not only 364, but, and maybe you're pointing to a different verse, because that verse says, "Say, O people of the book, come to a word common between us and you, that we shall worship none but God, shall not associate aught with him, and shall not take as lords apart from God. And if they turn away, then say, bear witness that we are submitters." I mean, to me, that this verse is actually calling towards them to come to that common word between us and become submitters. So I don't see this as going against my theory. Now, there are verses in the Quran that can be even harsher to the people of the book. But in that case, I would just ask you to read usually verses before and after, which usually mitigate it. So even after 364, you have kind of mitigating verses which go in a very pluralistic sense. For example, just a few verses down, 369, it's only a group among the people of the book who wish to make you go astray. And then going forward, 375, among the people of the book is one who, were you to entrust him with a stack of gold, would render it back to you. So I think the Quran, when it talks about people of the book, is always talking about some good ones and some bad ones. But I think, so yeah. Okay, so I did suspect it was the wrong verse. So you're saying it's verse 110. But if you look at 113 right next to it, you see it says, "But they are not all alike. Among the people of the book is an upright community." So like I said, you can just look at nearby verses. And so what I say is I think you should read the Quran thematically, holistically, and not in an atomistic way. So even that verse 3:110, you are the best community ever raised. You encourage good, forbid evil, and believe in God. Had the people of the book believed, that would have been better for them. So yes, if they believe in you, that's better for them. And actually it's khayran lahum, so that's better for them. I think that should be it. I think I do have to run for it. I'm actually going to catch an iftar late, unless there's one last question maybe I can take.
Okay, Qudus, you are on mute.
Dr. Qudus, you are muted.
There are a few questions. Let me ask Mehran Dibaji, because he has a few questions to ask, and he's here. So open your microphone and ask it, and then maybe summarize the few questions in one comprehensive question. Thank you.
It's really tough to summarize 5 questions in one, but I understand Dr. Hashmi is gonna run. And again, thank you for the talk. Again, I agree with you that salvation is for Jews and Christians in general, based on verses like Surah Baqarah 61 or 62. I think you also mentioned it at the beginning. But I'm not convinced. How do you justify a lot of verses that are strongly about identity of Muslims? Like in the same chapter, Surah Baqarah, it talks about Qibla, and I think it's actually in the middle of talking a lot about Jews. It talks in the middle that the Qibla, the direction of your prayer, should not be the same as the Jews. I think and there are many parts of the Quran that clearly draws a line, very bold line actually, with Jews and Christianity. And I think the mentions of Christians and Jews, I do not know the statistics that you brought from, I think, Fred Donner or something like that, but to my understanding, most of the time, it's actually more criticizing the beliefs that are not accepted in the religion that is called Islam. And I think Islam is a keyword for the true religion that is introduced in Quran. And that true religion is not necessarily same as the religion that the audience of the Quran, and as labeled as Jews and Christian, had that. And that's because we have a lot of, strong criticism against them. So I think you mentioned some of your responses already. I mean, there are many other parts. For example, you mentioned in your talk about Surah Ma'idah 5, Surah number 5, verse 40, I think. But that verse is, in fact, to me, is completely against, or at least how I understand it, is very much against what your theory is about. Because I'm going to actually read through parts of the Qara'i translation. Sorry, 548, I said 40. It says, we have sent out to you the book within the truth, confirming that was before it. So confirming what was before it of the book, and as a dominant muḥammad over it. So this book is dominant over the other books. So judge between them. And then it says another part, not follow their desires against the truth that has come to you. So that's, I mean, unless we just interpret ta'ah, which is another part that I was going to ask, as a political thing, that I do not see any evidence that ta'ah is just a political term in Quran. And it seems to be also something that, because it comes to the belief of the Allah, and it says ta'ah after that from the Rasul or from your Prophet. So unless we interpret it that way, we cannot understand this verse and verses like that. And then it continues in the same verse, 48 of Surah number 5. Had Allah wished, He would have made you one community. But I think I heard that you said all of these are one community. I'm sure you had some thoughts about this verse as well. I was just curious what your thoughts are, or what your thoughts in general is about, like modification and correction of the Jews and Christianity beliefs in general.
Thank you so much for those excellent questions and pushback. So what I would say is, so you mentioned that the Quran stresses the separate Qibla or direction in Surah 2. But Surah 2 is also, for example, in Surah 2, 148, it actually says that to each community, there's a direction to turn to. And so actually that's like, so the Quran is, in my reading, the Quran is stressing particularity and difference, and also difference and unity. So yes, each religious community, sub-community has its own rituals and rites and practices. So I'm not saying, and that's why I push back against the idea that what I'm saying is completely relativistic, that, oh, you can do whatever you want. It's like, oh, you can go to a church, you can do a Christian ceremony, or no, I don't think that that's what the Quran is saying, or what I'm trying to call to either. Instead, the Quran seems to be saying that that these differences are divinely mandated, and each community follows its own thing. So the community, so the way I put it is, there was a supra community of submitters, and within that supra community are sub communities, and those sub communities consider, so the believers were one, the Jews and the Christians, and they each followed their own laws and scriptures. So that's what I'm arguing. And so, for example, if you look at 548, so I would read this differently. So the Quran is the Quran is the confirmer and protector of the previous scriptures. It is a criterion of them. But that's part of my theory, is that the people who followed the Prophet, they did read old scriptures through the Quranic lens. So previous scriptures are Quranicized in that sense. So the Christians who would have followed would probably be more Unitarian leaning than Trinitarian. So I'm not saying that the people who joined the community didn't have to make any changes, basically. So that's what I would say there. But yeah, I mean, you could definitely read these verses in different ways. But for example, like 548, if you read the wider passage, it's actually talking about, look at 547, right before 548. It says, let the people of the gospel judge by what God has sent down therein. Whosoever judges not by that which God has sent down, it is they who are the iniquitous. If you read in 544, just right before it, it's talking about the Torah in the same way. It says the Torah, there is a guidance and a light. And then you have to read 543, which is right before it, that says, and how is it that they come to you for judgment when they have the Torah, wherein is God's judgment? Yet even after that, they turn their backs and are not believers. In fact, this entire passage is talking about how the Jews and the Christians did not need to go to the prophet for judgment. And they were actually trying to trick the prophets. And so the Quran is saying here, you have the Torah, just use the Torah. But if they refuse to use the Torah and they come to you, O Muhammad, then you judge with the Quran. But that is going completely in my direction of saying that the early community in Medina, it was allowed to follow their laws and their scripture. But if they came to the prophet for judgment, then of course he would judge by the Quran. This shows that they viewed the scriptures in a parallel way. Otherwise, why would 543, 544, 547, why would it say to follow the Torah and the gospel? It should just say, these are all abrogated, superseded, follow the Quran only. Why would it say that the prophet, it would say that you have to come to the prophet for judgment? It actually says they don't need to come to the prophet for judgment. But this is a long debate. We could go back and forth forever on this. And so I respect your difference of opinion for sure. And no theory is, doesn't have tensions in it or holes that you can poke in it. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you. I know it's just the one question from Iran, and this is a different type of question. It's short. If thankfully can answer it, it's interesting. Muhammad Gandhari, Dr. Gandhari from Iran asked, "What is your opinion of the notion of the keys of the paradise in Doctrina Jacobi, ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad and its relationship with your thesis?" That old book, which is So in some sense, it seems Jacobi has some understanding of the Prophet and his religious role, and then Shafa'a or something like that. So I'm not sure what is the emphasis. The question is that maybe he's emphasizing it was differentiated, Islam identity and role of Prophet. I mean, I'll let you because there's no more. I'm not sure that Gandhari is here, but if he's here, he can explain more. So, but maybe you answer it, or if you want more explanation, I ask Gandhari explains himself. Is the question clear for you? I said, yeah.
The question is not 100% clear, so if he wants to clarify it, that would be great.
Yeah. Gandhar, could you open your mic, unmute yourself, and a little bit explain the question?
I mean,
yeah, maybe he's Iran near Sahar time. So, but you know, let's put it this way. I'm sorry. Let's put it this way. Maybe he's the other side, a kind of counter example, or wants you to clarify your theory. Wasn't this emphasized some special separated identity for Muslims through Prophet Muhammad or something like that? I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, from my understanding, and you know, I'm doing this off of memory, but that document is actually one of the documents that's used as proof that Jews were a part of that early movement. But I'd have to double check that. That is my understanding. Now, there is something else in the document about the keys of salvation and talking about intercession. But that's a whole different debate, I would say. But as far as I remember, that is actually used as a proof for an alliance between Jews and those Arabs, which would go in the direction of what I'm saying.
Yeah. Actually, if you say Patricia, yeah. So that's the detail. Maybe I was thinking the way Sean Antonio was recently put it, and the date also was changed as I'll push it a little bit later. So I let if there is some other question. Maybe this is interesting, but Dr. Ibrahim, which it's a good ending. If you have time, we keep you. I mean, no longer, but I know Dr. Ibrahim Salim Ibrahim asked, could Dr. Hashmi say a word about what publication is currently work on? Is it a book or a paper? Yeah, because I see you have lots of notes slides. So is it a paper, is it a book, or what is your plan?
So I always have all these open-ended projects that I've really tried to. I have a young kid. I'm doing all sorts of things. I'm praying and hoping that I can actually submit this by summer. Unfortunately, it's already become so expansive that I think it's too much for a single paper. So it might be a monograph, but you know how long it takes academics to get things out. So I'm on an academic timeline. So it might take a lifetime.
Put it out as a monograph, because I think academic work, sometimes if it comes out in journals, it'll just get buried for the wider public. And I think this is a great topic to have out there. And I think people, not just Muslims, but I think it would be really beneficial to a wider public. So I'd encourage you to do a monograph.
I'm going to try my best. Thank you so much. It's just getting anything done is so hard. Like finishing and stuff is so hard for me, but I'm definitely going to try my best.
Inshallah, it's so valuable.
Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. I do have to run now. I'm so sorry. I have to join an iftar late. So thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful, Dr. Hashmi. Inshallah, we see you again. So we bring you again for another talk on related topics. You see lots of interest there. And thanks again for accepting the invitation, and also given in California and then the iftar time. So it's really appreciated. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you. So, Dr. Quddusi, anything else to add, or just finish here?
No, I'm very thankful, Dr. Hashmi. And then I'm pretty sure we will see him again. He is interesting. There's video about the interview with Dr. Joshua Little about the age of Aisha was really spread a lot in the circles in Iran. There are translation of Farsi, a couple of Farsi translations of his writing. So people are very much interested. It's very informative. And he's putting the questions straight and go to the topic of interest, not going around some topics which are secondary. Or we are very thankful. So I don't take him more this time. And so hopefully, inshallah, we see him soon. And
yeah. Okay, then.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Quddusi, Dr. Biwaji, and then everybody joining the program. So inshallah, we're going to have another lecture, the last lecture of this series tomorrow, and then presented by Professor Gudardi, also from Harvard, Rethinking the Meaning of Deen in the Quran. So see you all tomorrow, and enjoy your day wherever you are. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
And then one thing, I know there were other questions, and Dr. saw that some other people raised their hands, but we tried the best to ask most. I think Dr. Musalai would send the questions, the written ones, to Dr. Hashmi to see it, because there were other questions there. So yeah, thank you very much.